Hey, Originals listeners, because no one else seems ready to do so, I am personally giving you permission to take off your mask. Take them off! And allow yourself to once again smell the terrible breath of others, not just your own. So are you vaxxed? Are you waxed? Are you ready to fax something? Throw jacks? Shop at Saks? If you're on a lower budget, TJ Maxx? Diet with X-Lax? Anyway, can't thank you enough for returning. I am unofficially declaring this the Originals Summer. Why don't we tempt the fair use gods and give a musical history of the leadoff guest for season 3, Moby. He was born Richard Melville Hall. At just a few days old, his father gave him the nickname of Moby in honor of Herman Melville, his great-great-great-uncle. His lineage might suggest that he grew up with great wealth. He did not. In fact, he was actually on food stamps, as he relates in his really, really great, occasionally heartbreaking, and very, very trippy new documentary, Moby Doc, which is available in select theaters and for pre-order on iTunes and Apple TV today. He grew up very poor in Darien, Connecticut, which happens to be one of the wealthiest towns in America, started playing in punk bands as a teenager, began going into New York City to DJ, and then, in 1991, he repurposed Laura Palmer's theme from Twin Peaks into a single, Go, which became a huge dance hit, especially in Europe. Moby got signed to Elektra Records, did a bunch of work on soundtracks, and then, in 1996, totally alienated his fans by releasing a punk album, Animal Rights. Having been deemed a total has-been by the entire musical establishment, he quietly began working on another album of electronic music, and he was resigned that he'd have to get a real 9-to-5 if this particular project failed. Now that project, his 5th album, Play, was released in 1999. The album notably utilized samples from black folk musicians the ethnomusicologist Alan Lomax had made in the early 20th century, like on Natural Blues and Honey. And then, of course, there was the mega dance hit Body Rock.
Rock, y'all, non-stop, y'all, to the beat, y'all, the body rock, y'all, so let's rock, y'all, non-stop, y'all, to the beat, y'all, the body rock, y'all.
If you ever left the house in 1999, if you went to a club, if you went to a clothing store, if you went to a cafe, you heard the shit out of Play. Moby went on to have his song Extreme Ways used at the end of all the Jason Bourne movies, and continued recording with such collaborators as the Flaming Lips' Wayne Coyne for this 2013 single, The Perfect Life.
The perfect life is all we need.
I assumed, as I imagine many others did, that Moby had that perfect life. And even though I liked and owned some of his music, I admit, since we were both out and about and single in the East Village at the same time, I, like many others, kind of resented him. He was rich. For a long time, he lived in this $6 million apartment overlooking Central Park. And he kind of seemed to be hogging the attention of every cute girl in Manhattan. Turns out I was far from alone in this sentiment, a fact which Moby, you'll find out, was painfully aware. For Moby, however, as he sets out in his 2 memoirs and now in his searingly painful biographical documentary, it was far from the perfect life. In fact, it felt like a living hell. One note, you might recall how in the midst of his book tour for his 2019 memoir, Then It Fell Apart, Moby was what I like to call soft canceled. He wasn't accused of any crimes, but just deemed by social media to be monstrous. I think maybe we should call it Teganed. He'd written about how he briefly dated Natalie Portman, and then she would claim that they hadn't dated at all. But his sin seems to be mostly about not giving her, or some of the others in the book who were mentioned, the heads up before publication. It effectively ended his book tour, which is too bad, I have to say, because the book is really an incredibly vivid, funny memoir about what it's like to be on top of the world, as he had been after the release of Play, and then slowly fall to the ground in increasingly humiliating ways, helped in large part by his alcoholism and drug addiction. I've screwed up in similar ways before, so if you're looking for a host who's going to vivisect Moby about the events of 2 years ago, this interview may disappoint you. But I think that might be the only disappointing thing about this conversation. So I want to play a clip from Moby Doc, which might give you a sense of what, for this person at least, it felt like to be on the top, but want to jump. Small warning here and elsewhere in the episode, there will be some fairly graphic descriptions of suicidal behavior.
I was in Barcelona for the MTV Music Awards. And I'd been told beforehand that I was going to be winning an MTV Music Award. And it was going to be my third or fifth MTV Music Award that I was winning. And I got to my hotel in Barcelona, and there are 4 huge apartments at the top of this hotel. And my neighbors were P. Diddy, Bon Jovi, and Madonna, overlooking Barcelona and the Mediterranean. And that night, I ended up getting very drunk. And everything was perfect. You know, everything I'd ever wanted had been given to me, even more so. You know, like I just wanted to make a few obscure records, and all of a sudden, like, I'm at the top of this crazy hotel, and I've sold 10 or 20 million records, and I was so despondent. How strange it was that I'd been given everything, and I'd never been more depressed. And one of the only things that kept me from killing myself was the fact that the windows in the hotel didn't open wide enough.
This is The Originals, and I'm your host, Andrew Goldman. I spent decades interviewing celebrities for magazines, and as Moby quite astutely points out in this interview, many of them, I found, had the personalities of houseplants. I created The Originals to interview cultural figures who actually had something to say, who wanted to really share of themselves. In this regard, Moby will not disappoint. Welcome to Season 3, which promises to be the best yet, and the second in proud partnership with Los Angeles Magazine. Moby, welcome to The Originals.
Thank you for having me.
You talk a lot in all of your work, in your memoirs and in your film, about suicidal ideation. And I was thinking about it, and I just, I think anybody who's a thinking person eventually probably thinks about how they would kill themselves. How'd you want to do it?
Well, I went through so it started in a very non-serious way when I was around 15 years old, and I was a depressed teenager, and I was listening to Joy Division, and I thought if I were to kill myself, that finally, like, the girl I had a crush on at Darien High School would like me back. I'd be dead, but small price to pay if she liked me back.
Right.
And so then I used to think, while I was listening to Joy Division cassettes on my Walkman, I would stand on a bridge over I-95 thinking all I have to do is jump off in front of a truck.
I've been there on 95 as well. Gotcha.
Yeah. So clearly I didn't do that, but it was like a very romantic idea. You know, the classic thing of imagining all the kids at school crying, realizing now, late in hindsight, like they probably would have just been annoyed and thought I was a jerk.
Yeah.
So time passes, and it was, I guess, the last few years of my addiction, my drinking, my drug taking, I was very depressed, very anxious, and I just was tired of being alive. And so almost every night when I would come home after drinking and taking a ton of drugs, I would think to myself, okay, tonight I'm going to do it. Obviously, I never did. The closest I got to trying was taking a bunch of pills and tying a bag around my head, a plastic bag. It would have been funny if it was like a hemp bag.
The Jerzy Kosinski.
Oh, is that how he killed himself?
Yes, I'm pretty sure.
I didn't know that Jerzy Kosinski killed himself. I actually haven't read him in such a long time. I remember, I'm
sorry you had to hear the news this way.
Oh, I was a big fan of his. I thought that was the best way to do it because it seemed effective and polite. Like everything else I could think of seemed very impolite. Mm-hmm. And I'm sorry for being graphic or morbid, but like if you slit your wrists in the bathtub, then someone has to find you like that, and that's very unpleasant.
However, it sort of cleans itself, though. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I thought this was insofar, like, because you don't have to see the person's face. Yeah. Like it's very hygienic. So that was how I was gonna do it, but it never quite worked out. There was a funny little aside about that. The closest I ever got a few months before I got sober, I was very depressed. And so I actually thought, okay, I'm finally going to do it. Took a bunch of Vicodin, a bunch of Xanax, tied the black plastic bag over my head. And the reason I took the black plastic bag off my head is it smelled terrible. It didn't smell like garbage. It smelled like PVC.
Yeah.
And there was just this little part of my brain that said, you don't want your last experience of life smelling the inside of a black plastic garbage bag.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you didn't do it. Are you glad now?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, because it's also like, why rush it? Like, it's going to happen. Not suicide, but like death happens eventually. So why rush it if you don't have to?
I want to talk a little bit about your background. You were born in Harlem, and how did your dad die?
Well, so I was born in Harlem in 1965, and as far as I can tell, my parents didn't have a very happy marriage. You know, they were living in a basement apartment, I think on around 140th Street in Harlem. My dad worked at Columbia University, and my mom worked at Barnard. And when I was around 2 years old, I guess their marriage had really imploded. And so she said that she wanted a divorce. She said that she was going to take me away from him. And so he got drunk and killed himself by driving a car into a wall. So basically, by the time I was 2.5 or 3 years old, everything had already gone completely off the rails. Like and things got worse and weirder after that as well. But like the first couple of years were, even if I wasn't aware of it at the time, pretty challenging. I once had a therapist who had a great sense of humor, who said that like, if it weren't for the presence of the rescue animals in my life, he's like, for sure. He's like, you would have been like a Jeffrey Dahmer style psychopath. Like you were just like an inch away from like eating people and burying them in your basement.
Moby, there's nobody in the basement right now?
Come again?
There's nobody that you're hiding. Yeah, okay. He started to, just for the record show, he started to sweat.
Didn't you get the disclaimer? That's the one thing we're not supposed to talk about.
Look, as we find out in Moby Doc, you know, your mother was not probably the best mom in the world. She didn't tell you at 2 or 3 that your father drove into a wall, did she? How did you find that out?
Let me think. How old would I have actually been? Like 34. It was after my mom had died. I had this, what I think of as almost like a Russian literature, like Chekhov style family drama epiphany. Like I was talking to my aunts, uncle and stepfather, and I was told all these things. Like one, that my father had killed himself. I had no idea. You know, I thought he died.
Your mother had never said that.
We never talked about him.
You just, okay.
Like after he died, he disappeared, kind of like, you know, like Comrade Trotsky doesn't exist. Like he just sort of disappeared.
Yeah.
I had pictures, but I just thought it was normal to not ever talk about your dead parent. And so I found out that he had killed himself. I found out that my mom had tried to take me away from him. I had found out that Child Services had kind of tried to take me away from my mom. And then the real biggie is I found out I have a half brother somewhere.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's all these like revelations at age 34. I still don't know who that half brother might be. I do know it's not Karl Rove.
Okay, all right.
But for a very specific reason.
Why? Tell me.
I did an interview with Politico when it first launched. And this was before I got sober, and I was very drunk in the interview, and I talked about having this half brother. And I jokingly said, maybe it's Karl Rove. And this was when Karl Rove was chief of staff under George Jr. And Karl Rove wrote me a letter on White House stationery. And I remember exactly what it said. It said, "Dear Moby, it's not me. For one thing, I'm 17 years older than you, and I don't have any musical ability. Have you considered James Carville because he's bald and plays the guitar too? Sincerely, Karl Rove." And this was so disconcerting. One, that Karl Rove, he knew who I was. He read his own press, and that he was funny. Like I was really discomfited to find out that Karl Rove actually has a sense of humor. I remember when I got the letter, I started asking friends of mine in the world of politics. I was like, is this a joke? Like, is someone punking me? And no, it turns out apparently Karl Rove does read his own press and is funny. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I still have never met him. And also it's not that it has anything to do with anything you probably want to talk about, but it is kind of odd that those architects of evil now seem kind of rational and benign compared to the lunacy of the current Republican Party.
I do think about that a lot. Speaking of Donald Trump, I heard something, and I don't know whether this is apocryphal or not. Can you tell me what a knob touch is?
Okay. It would have been 2002, I think. And I was out at a bar with some friends. Did you ever live in New York?
Yes.
Okay, so you know
yes,
that
I lived on Houston between A and B.
Oh, okay. Well, I was on Houston Mott for 25 years, so neighbors. So this was before I got sober. I was very drunk, and I was at one of those. It seemed like every night there was an event for something stupid. You know, it's like Ralph Lauren.
I covered those events. I was the guy covering the event with the notebook. So yes, I know those events.
So like Ralph Lauren is launching a paint color. Martha Stewart has a new line of dessert forks or something. And like, if you were a drunk like I was, you went to a lot of them because the alcohol was free. So I went to this one on Park Avenue at around 19th Street, around the corner from where Barnes & Noble, I assume, still is. And my friends, who I'm not going to name because I don't want to get them in trouble, were talking about this game that they played in college called Knob Touch, where they would basically take their penises out of their pants, flaccid, completely sad and flaccid, and walk around a party and just casually brush up against people. And you would get points for the number of people you brushed up against.
Yes.
Keep in mind, according to them, it was completely non-sexual. They would brush up against men, women, older, younger.
I think, Moby, in this day and age, it is important to note, because I feel like knob touch would not go over. And go ahead. Yeah.
So I'm not going to talk about the ethics of their non-consensual knob touching, except for that, apparently it was just stupid, drunken, platonic. And they challenged me to play knob touch at this party. And so I did, but only against one person. And so the only person I have knob touched was Donald Trump. He was standing by the stairs at this restaurant, and I brushed past him, and my sad, inadequate, flaccid penis just brushed against the hem of his garment.
I really wish you'd rubbed it into him. Because, like when you're famous like you were, you can do whatever you want. You can rub your flaccid penis and nobody cares.
Yeah, someone said that once.
Okay, so have you actually not used since 2008?
October 2008 was when, I finally realized that drinking and doing drugs was destroying every part of me, and I quit.
You've talked at great length, in your documentary and in your memoirs about anxiety and about suicidal ideation. Does that all go away, or is this still stuff that you have to deal with?
Getting sober was great, but so was going to therapy, so was going hiking every day, so was eating better, so like all these small things, exercising, reading books by people who seem to have figured things out, combine all of these things, and I feel like that's what's led me to the place where I am now, which is someone who is generally not depressed and doesn't want to kill himself.
Yeah. Anybody who hasn't read at least your second memoir, Then It Fell Apart, should read it, because it's, I hate to say this, it's a very sad book, but it is also incredibly entertaining as celebrity memoirs go. And so I'm reading this book, and on the one hand, you're describing yourself as incredibly unfulfilled by fame, but I'm sort of living through what seems incredibly heady, like you walking into, the downtown club Sway and hanging out with, it's not only just Bono. Michael Stipe is there, but it's not just Bono and Michael Stipe, it's Salman Rushdie. And I'm thinking to myself, well, I would certainly want to do that. I mean, that must have been thrilling.
I don't want to disagree because I like the idea of being agreeable.
Feel free to disagree. I love disagreeable people.
But basically, one of the things I'm most grateful for is having gone through it to gain the perspective that I have now. Because we live in a culture that is obsessed with fame and is obsessed with success. And it's one of the things I wanted to address in the documentary is we're all collectively obsessed with fame and success. And we all have this assumption that fame and success will inure us from the human condition and deliver us endless happiness. But in order to believe that, we have to ignore all of the evidence. The evidence of the Robin Williams, of the Anthony Bourdain, of the Avicii, of the Amy Winehouse, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so 2000, 2001, 2002, when I was adopted by the Glitterati and invited to their parties, I'm so glad I experienced it because I realized it's not great.
It's not.
And you can't know that it's not great until you're in the middle of it. It's fine. Like when you're at when you're at Puffy's white party, when you're at a dinner with the Clintons, whatever, it's like, it's fine. But you realize oftentimes, and I'm sure that you've experienced this, and I assume lots of people listening to this have probably experienced it, where like famous people are like normal people, but oftentimes just a lot less interesting because they make less of an effort.
That's so interesting.
When I hang out with my friends, they make an effort to be funny. They make an effort to ask how your day was. They make an effort to be kind. Famous people oftentimes are sort of like houseplants. Like they show up and they believe, and I was one of these people, they believe that by showing up, they've done half the work.
Yeah.
And which is not to malign famous people, because oftentimes they're treated that way. The world treats them that way. But at this point, I feel like I've met everybody, and I have yet to meet someone who is smarter or funnier or more interesting than almost anybody I grew up with.
It's interesting because we see a lot of your friendship in the documentary with David Bowie. And every time, and you talk about this burgeoning friendship, and every time I think about anybody being friends with David Bowie, I think about, do you remember the Onion story that ran in 2013? The headline was David Bowie asks Iman if they should just do lasagna again. I cannot imagine like David Bowie's gone now, but I cannot imagine like David Bowie in his natural environs actually doing what other people do. Was there anything? I mean, he was your next door neighbor, correct? In
he lived
downtown.
Across the street from me, yeah. And I mean, to put it in a little bit of contextual perspective, the first job I ever had was as a caddy at Weburn Golf Club in Darien, Connecticut. Mm-hmm. Keep in mind, I was poor white trash, wrong side of the tracks, literally. And I only worked at this job long enough to buy David Bowie records. Once I had my collection of David Bowie records, I quit the job. So I loved his music. I loved him. Like, he was the greatest musician, greatest songwriter of all time, as far as I was concerned. And then in 99 or 2000, he and Iman moved to an apartment across the street from me in Little Italy, now, I guess, Nolita. And we became friends. We had holidays together. We went on tour together. We worked on music together. And so he was my normal friend, but I never for 1 second felt normal. Like, I always felt like Wayne in Wayne's World when he meets Alice Cooper. So the whole time I was kind of like holding my shit together. Like,
I mean, there is the saying, what's interesting about going through your work is there is the saying of never meet your heroes. But I think maybe if it should say never meet your heroes unless you're famous when you do it, because so many people actually seem quite pleasant, with the exception of one of the worst interviews that I've done, which is with Mick Jagger, which you could sort of,
Oh, I met him a couple of times. And honestly, like, the first time we were introduced, we shook hands, and he wasn't interested. So I won't even criticize him for it, but like clearly, like he was on the prowl, and I was not being prowled. I didn't fit his criteria, and he just wasn't interested. Like, so, I mean, I could have seen it as an affront, but like it was kind of like when the Terminator is like scanning humans and just ignores the ones that he's not interested in. Like, it sort of felt like that. In a way, because his work was always so theatrical, you know, even the sort of like the confessional songs, you don't necessarily want him to be like, I don't really care if he's a nice person to still love the music. Like even like a song like Angie or Wild Horses, like these are theatrical songs. It's kind of amazing to me that like the social justice warriors have not discovered the body of work of the Rolling Stones, though.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because you are very, very candid and in a way that is really disarming about the fact that you had easy access that you took advantage of to willing women, that you were somebody, I don't know if that was part of your addiction, but I mean, you characterized it as a lot of women. And I assume all of it was consensual, but if you've gone through a period of years and years of that, I mean, at this period in time, is there constantly worry that somebody's just going to come out and say, you know what, something happened that shouldn't have happened?
It's odd and almost a little paradoxical to be the same person and a different person. And it was the interesting thing about making the documentary, about writing memoirs, is like revisiting who I had been and not really recognizing it, which is so, but it was me, same DNA, same baldness, same posture, same et cetera. But I look back at the priorities and the behavior, and I don't see myself in it, but having said that, I know that everything that I did was ethical ethical in that it involved consent. And the only person I tended to hurt was me. You know, the only person I ever fantasized about physically harming was me. I mean, I was once accused of rape. This was in the early days of social media. Someone on my Moby.com message boards had accused me of rape. And I was having been raised by very progressive feminists who were the, ancestors of suffragettes. Like, I was like, that's the most serious possible accusation short of murder or genocide.
Sure.
And some people on the message boards followed up with this person, and she lived in the UK, and she's made this accusation. But at the time, I was in Australia. And I'm not making light of this, but like what she said was that I was a space wizard and I was raping her magically in her dreams. So as far as an accusation...
So is this in the original post?
She eventually revealed this.
All right. So if this was the original post, I don't know if I would have sweat it, but okay.
But the culture in which we live, where due process has just been thrown out the window, I wish I wasn't talking about it in any way involving your question. I wish we were just having a conversation about due process. Like, I find it, a lot of things about popular culture today to be very concerning. Like when suddenly the left are banning books.
Yeah.
Like, call me crazy. When I read Fahrenheit 451, I assumed it was going to be the Republicans who were going to be banning books. Like, shutting down speech, banning speakers from college campuses, making accusations that might have a lot of validity and legitimacy, but without any aspect of due process. The whole thing is very upsetting, I think.
Yeah. Well, taking it to sort of a personal place, one thing that we hear about in your documentary, and you're an unmarried man at this point. What we hear in your documentary is that intimacy was very scary for you, and that you actually, I mean, if you would get too close to somebody, what would happen to you? Was there actually a physical response?
Oh boy, yeah. I would have actual panic attacks. It's the only thing in my life that has ever, one of the only things in my life that's actually ever given me full-blown panic attacks. And there's a reason why I work alone, and I've been single for 5 years, and I live alone, and at this point, I've sort of made peace with it. Like, I've sort of accepted, oh, this is my lot in life, is to not have relationships, is to be single, to have friends, to have a spiritual life, to read books, to hopefully, make music, write books, do things. But to have that partner or spouse or girlfriend, I just have sort of accepted that's not a part of my life.
When I was going through your work, I thought to myself, it seemed like there were a few times when you would back off of people you'd been seeing being like, I have an anxiety disorder, this is just too much. And I wondered if all the women actually believed it, because that to me sounds like, I bet, did any of them were like, oh, this is his way to be a rock star by saying he has an anxiety disorder and he's full of shit and he just wants to fuck everything on Earth.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I absolutely work under the assumption that a lot of people thought I was feeding them a line. When I would have to leave a relationship because of panic attacks, because of anxiety disorder, and people would tell me that they thought I was full of shit. And I was like, oh, trust me, I wish I was.
Yeah.
I don't understand how people have relationships without debilitating panic.
Yeah. People like me, I think men mostly, I think we could probably say it's mostly men, fantasize about the kind of life that you've described both in your film and your memoirs, of basically the availability of sex wherever you wanted it, whenever you wanted. And I was thinking about it. Did you ever watch The Twilight Zone?
Yeah.
Do you remember that there was an episode called A Nice Place to Visit, where a gambler never loses and every woman responds to him? And I wondered, and basically you find out at the end that this is his idea of hell, of having, full availability of women and never losing at the craps table. Was it everything that every red-blooded male imagines, the orgies, the drugs, and all this? Or was there a point where you were like, this fucking sucks, this was way overrated?
There's that question of, and actually I addressed in therapy, what was the utility of promiscuity? And I have to say, I think you might be slightly overstating my promiscuity. I think of the Russell Brands and Tommy Lees of the world, and I can't even hold water compared to the lunacy that those guys have gotten up to.
Yeah.
But what I realized is what was behind all of the promiscuity was simply looking for validation. Because some of the greatest one-night stands I had were completely platonic. But they involved this notion of being seen and being validated. By
having platonic, you mean no sex?
Yeah.
What?
I remember once I had a threesome in Minnesota that was completely platonic.
Wait, that's not possible. No.
It was, meaning there was affection, but there was no kissing, there was no sex, but somehow it felt validating.
Okay.
And I left even feeling more, I don't know, just feeling better than I would have if it had been some crazy drug-fueled
shit
orgy.
I gotta go back to your book. When I read about there are a variety of threesomes, now should I assume that some of them were platonic? Because I was assuming
a lot of them were not. But now when you talk about a life envied by red-blooded Americans, I don't know, or American males.
You're not going to dispute that, are you?
Well, except that having crippling panic attacks to the extent that you spend 5 years completely monastic and single, I don't know how many red-blooded American men are necessarily pining for that.
Yeah. Now, the one thing also that sort of struck me was, there was a lot of cocaine for a long period of time. And what cocaine seems to be great for is the will, but not the ability. Were there years when you were just impotent because of the cocaine, or did you figure out a way around that?
what's the heart is willing, but the flesh is weak.
Exactly.
Like that should come every time you buy cocaine. Like the dealer should say, like, the heart is willing, the flesh will be very, very weak.
Yes.
Yeah, cocaine was such an interesting drug. The therapist I talked about earlier, in the year before I got sober, I was really, truly wrestling with addiction. Like 20 drinks a night, a couple $100 of cocaine every day. Like it was cliched and stupid and bad. And he got tired of me complaining. So he jokingly said, he's like, if you really want to get sober, do a lot more cocaine.
Interesting. If you
And he
really
said,
want...
because trust me, he's like, if you start doing a lot more cocaine, you'll get sober really quick. Like that bottoms people out hard. He said, if you just drink, he said, you could keep doing that for another 20 years. If you start doing a lot of cocaine, you're going to get sober very, very, very quickly. Turns out
it was
right.
It was interesting how long you held out on cocaine. You were you were doing a lot of drinking and a lot of like club drugs, but cocaine came kind of late.
Growing up, that was the drug. The two drugs that scared me growing up were heroin and cocaine, understandably, because they're both. And then I guess it was because also on a musical level, cocaine has a very spotty track record. There have been great records made on cocaine, but it's also led to a lot of musicians making their worst records.
I'm trying to think. What are the great cocaine records of all time?
Station to Station by David Bowie.
Okay, yes.
Every disco record ever made.
Tell me, Moby, you describe what it's like to come off of an album like Play, which I think was this the biggest electronica album in history? Isn't that?
Yeah, probably.
It's like tens of millions. What is it? I think I read somewhere
somewhere over 10 million.
12 million copies. And I think about that, and you've described how in a lot of your efforts after that you felt like there wasn't a real sort of like creative purity, that you were actually seeking to replicate success, that was something that you were trying to do. And I think about this sometimes, and I think about it's got to happen with a lot of musicians, because I feel like granted what happened to Michael Jackson as a kid, well, traumatic. This was a guy who I feel like for most of his life was chasing Thriller and never being able to match it. Do you feel like there is bad luck in having a hit that big?
It depends. It's an interesting question. So I realized sort of in hindsight, like up until the album Play, I had wanted a career as a musician, but my focus had been on music itself. The ability that music had to trigger the most intense emotional reactions I'd ever had to anything. And that was what I was pursuing. And then, to my great shame, but I'm also grateful to have gone through it because I learned so much from it, there was about a 6 or 7 year period where I still loved music, but I really wanted it to create more success for me.
Yeah.
I really wanted the validation, the legitimacy, basically the ability to sort of like manage the human condition in my own way. And it drove me crazy that I was not good at creating that. But empirically, I just wasn't good at it.
At being a successful...
At being a successful musician, but also trying to be, at trying to write things that would get played on the radio. Like I honestly sucked at it.
I wonder, do you think about it? Do you think about why, is there something pure in the way that somebody who's had success for like 4 or 5 decades, like why does Neil Young keep making music that works? Does he not give a flying fuck about what people think of it? What makes a great musician? Somebody who can, decade after decade, after doing some really, look, David Bowie, here's a guy that his first couple albums were, did nothing, but this was a guy who stuck with it, right? I just wonder what the difference is between some people that can make a few huge albums and some people that can have decades and decades of them.
I would say that almost no one, like, for example, you mentioned Neil Young, and I love Neil Young, but like, he has not had really big records since, Keep on Rockin' in the Free World was big. That was 92.
All right. Well, we're going back to the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. you think like
Yeah.
Harvest Moon, and then you go back to Buffalo Springfield. I mean, this is a guy who's had like, okay, we don't have to argue about Neil Young, but yes.
Oh, I trust me, I love Neil Young. He's one of the public figures I never want to meet because I'm afraid, like, if I caught him on a bad day, he might be a dick.
I bet he would be. But do you know what I'm talking about? Do you think that there's a difference in the way that people create?
For whether it's a writer, a musician, a painter, a filmmaker, or whatever, is basically the desperate love of making things, of creating, of like, and everything else ultimately has to take a back seat to that. And I think that's, like, for example, I read something about Billy Joel recently, and I am relatively indifferent about Billy Joel. Like, I think he's got some nice hits, but apparently, and I could be mistaken, he hasn't gone into a studio or written music in decades. And I read that and I just thought, what else do you do? Like, with the 24 hours in a day, if you're asleep for 6 hours, you watch TV for 2 hours, you eat for another hour or 2 hours, like, what else do you do? And with a lot of, like, my approach to music is I can't think of a single thing that's better to do than to be in my studio working on music.
Yeah.
And whether anyone hears it, that's okay. If they do, if they don't, that's fine. But it's that desperate joy and compulsion around the act of making it. Yeah. And so I assume a lot of other people would have that as well. And then every couple of years, they stumble across something that people actually want to pay attention to.
Yeah. This is not something that I would ask somebody who hadn't sort of addressed it themselves. I mean, you talk about life as somebody who was the further you got away from that success, you felt like people treated you differently, and you were chasing that success. But I mean, was there a moment where you felt like you weren't the rock star that you'd been at that particular moment?
Oh boy, yeah. I mean, well, countless moments like that. I was signed in the States to this record label called V2. And for about 3 years, I was the biggest artist on V2. And so every time I went to their offices, I would walk in and there was a big poster of me behind the receptionist desk. And I would walk in and everyone was nice to me and they were all my best friends. And then I remember after my album, or around the album Hotel, which failed in North America, I walked in and my poster had been taken down and a poster of the White Stripes had been put up, which made perfect sense because they were the biggest artists on the label now. But like that physical feeling of like, oh, I've been replaced. Like I've been supplanted. Yeah. And then of course, like the new record label boss invited me to his birthday party and didn't talk to me. And so I was sort of like standing in the corner, like drinking vodka, being ignored by the people at the record label who'd been so nice to me beforehand. Like, I'm not looking for sympathy. I'm just saying like, that's a pretty clear representation of the fact like, oh, you've gone from being a golden child to like a lowercase pariah stepchild. Everybody loves a great comeback story. Do you, in your heart of hearts, are you sort of scheming, being like, Play 2 will be coming out and I will crush all of those people at that record label. My poster is going to be huge at the next. No, that's like, it kind of reminds me of I always get confused. Is it Shakespeare or the Bible that says death, where is your sting?
I don't know. I'm not smart enough to know either of those.
So
you're much more well-read than I am, obviously. I forget. It's if I was well-read, I would know which one it was. But basically that quote, death, where is thy sting? And so like to that point, it's one thing to sort of like plot your return Donald Trump style in Mar-a-Lago, to like show all those people who didn't believe in you. It's another to realize that like the greatest triumph is to remove yourself from the field of battle. Yeah. You go hiking, you hang out with some friends, you eat some vegan pizza, read a book. If you're like me, you might be suspecting that Moby could be pouring it on just a tad thick about exactly how loathed he was as a lowercase pariah stepchild. Now, if you are, just look up the March 2005 New York Times review of his album Hotel by Khalifa Sane titled What's Left After the End of Music. Now, this is about as devastating a review as you can imagine, and it's personal in a way that you don't often see in the Times unless they're covering murderous dictators. So I actually have to agree with him on this point. He was the anti-Sally Field. They really, really hated him. I wanted to mention your album Hotel, and you reference it in your documentary about a New York Times review, and you made it sound so brutal, and I was like, it was bad. It couldn't possibly be, and I looked it up, and I was like, wow, that guy really hated you.
Oh boy, yeah.
Why? What was that about?
That's such a fun question. It's sort of like what are deconstructing the forensics around why people hated me. So yeah, I've wondered about that. I think part of it was that I wouldn't go away. You know, like I was so public, and I had an opinion about everything, and I was such a loudmouth, and I was at every party, and I didn't have the decency to be like Tom York. Like, you know, find a house, 8 hours from the nearest city and like live there and only communicate with people once every 18 months. Instead, I lived in Lower Manhattan and I went out every night and was just a loudmouth who wouldn't go away. I mean, people hate success anyway, especially if it's like, a cultural or, demographic that's close to them. It's much easier to sort of like laud the success of people who live far away and don't look like us.
Yeah.
But when it's like, when you have nerdy people in Lower Manhattan annoyed by me as a nerdy person in Lower Manhattan, like it's pretty easy to understand why they had such contempt for me. Also, I sometimes wonder, there's an old Simpsons episode where Lisa keeps getting beaten up by a bully. And they find out the reason for it is because Lisa smells like a nerd. And so I sometimes wonder if like it was my nerd sweat, like that contributed to people hating me so much.
I mean, you read that and you would think that, oh my God, did he sleep with his sister or something on the rub? I mean, because it really felt very personal. And the thing that was sort of interesting in the movie, I think that you mentioned about what the comments said. The comments were even more vitriolic. And then I said to myself, God, didn't you have somebody in your life that told you never read the comments?
Well, I was such a complete narcissist that up until around 2003, 2004, like I read everything that I could find about myself. And then there was that review in the New York Times, which made me realize like, oh, maybe reading reviews isn't such a smart idea. Mm-hmm. And I remember this so clearly. I read a Gawker Gothamist piece, and it was something snarky about like I wore an ugly sweater or something. Mm-hmm. And one of the comments was someone saying that this person saying they hated me so much that if they saw me walking down the street, they were going to stab me and watch me bleed to death in front of them. And I sort of had this moment of this epiphany where I was like, oh, my sense of self, my well-being, my emotional state should not be informed by or determined by people I've never met.
Right.
And so that's when I tried to start this discipline of like, don't read comments, don't read reviews, don't watch yourself on TV. And I've gotten really good at it.
Yeah. I felt for you in 2019 because, I mean, you had this book that look, you've got on the cover, you got a great Stephen Colbert blurb, and on the back you got Salman Rushdie talks about it and a great Rolling Stone review, and then you go out and all of a sudden it's like, I feel like you've talked about how you don't particularly want to talk about the fact that you wrote about Natalie Portman in the book, and then she said that you were a bit of a creeper. If you read the book, you'll see that the description is fairly innocuous and innocent. And having had this shit kicked out of me before online, I'm not judging whether including her without telling her was right or wrong, but I have to say I felt for you because, you write a book in which you were incredibly lacerating and you say things about how worthless you are and how you had no love for yourself, but then you have the entire world kind of in a chorus being like, yeah, that guy fucking sucks. I mean, was that hard for you?
It was obviously logistically a little challenging to achieve that when I had the nice people at TMZ, et cetera, following me around everywhere.
Is that what happened? Because I didn't actually follow it closely, but did you have to be sort of thrown off of your book tour? Was it kind of like derailed?
Oh yeah, without question.
What happened?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I wish, if I'm being completely frank, I apologize for the fact that I can't go into it in great detail for a bunch of reasons.
Yeah.
One, I'm hesitant of this being, like if we were just hanging out. Yeah, so I'm a little wary, but also what I will say is that it did definitely strengthen my belief that my realization of a few years before that who I am and my worldview and my sense of self has to be informed by friends, health, spirituality, creativity, family, not the opinions of people I've never met, especially.
I mean, I hope you can laugh about it now. Iron Sheik weighed in. Did you know that?
But I don't know who the Iron Sheik is.
You didn't watch enough wrestling. Anyway, the Iron Sheik said, "Fuck the Moby" at the time, which I think if you knew who the Iron Sheik was, you would laugh. But
okay, I'll take that as like a badge of honor. One of the saddest ones, I don't even think it was around this, was I was reading a Stephen King book in an airport, and almost as it was a book where like cell phones make people crazy, and there's this aside in the book where he insults me. And it's not even related to the narrative. It's nothing. He just all of a sudden has one of the characters say that he hates me. And I'm like, really? Even Stephen King? Like what have I done to like piss off Stephen King? Like basically, clearly it's nerd sweat.
Moby, congratulations on the film. Thank you so much for being on the Originals.
Okay, it was my pleasure.
That's our show. Please, if you haven't already, subscribe, rate, review, and tell 10,000 of your friends how much you love the show. This episode was produced by me, Andrew Goldman, and the man who I like to think of as my hirsute work wife, Rob Heath. Thanks to Scott Feinstein and Kabir Malhotra at 42 West and all the folks at Los Angeles Magazine, notably Silver Fox editor Mayor Rashawn. The Originals is, as always, a highly replaceable production.